Okay, looks like we're live. So I want to welcome everybody to the program tonight. I just want to make sure that everything in YouTube land is okay. And so, okay, so it looks like we're good to go. So I want to welcome everybody to the program. Tonight's going to be a very interesting discussion. It's actually part two, I guess you would call it, of a discussion that we had last week over at Adam's channel. And Adam and I, if you don't know him, he goes by the handle Curious Christianity. He's got a great channel. He's kind of a man after my own heart because he looks at the data and then he forms his own conclusions. So he's like one of those very few people that I run into who can actually think for themselves. They're not going to be like, well, Dr. So-and-so said, well, Dr. So-and-so. So I liked that. And we had a debate about the millennium. He takes a mill position. I take a pre-mill position. It went pretty well. And then he invited me on his channel for an interview. So we did that last week. It's going to be released, I believe, next week, you said. But I want to welcome Adam to. Yeah. Okay, great. I want to welcome you to the channel, Adam. For those who don't know you, you've got a great channel, and you're also one of the most smartest up and coming apologists I know. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. And I very much appreciate that introduction. You know what? Some of the old apologists are going to be going the way of the dinosaurs. And so we have to have some new blood. And so I'm going to be one of the newer guys.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't mind new blood. And this is the reason why I decided to do this, because I know that you had some question or some not questions, but other people had some questions about Genesis 3. And I know you had done some podcasts on your show about Genesis chapter 3. And you asked me last week, you asked, well, what about Genesis chapter 3? And I said, man, this is a can of worms. It's going to take a long time to get through. I said, let's save this for the discussion we do on the show. Now, I'm not going to give my view tonight. Actually, I refuse to give my view on early Genesis. I actually have videos on my channel if anyone wants to check those out about what I believe. So I'm not going to be hashing through what I believe. What I'm going to be asking you, though, is what you believe, and then we could explore the ramifications of that and get into brass tacks. But first, if you don't mind, could you just give the audience a little, I guess, introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Adam. I'm a Christian apologist, and I'm doing way more biblical apologetics. I'm focused more on inter-Christianity studies and topics. And so one of the things that I really look to do, though, is to provide thought-provoking content. I want people to think about the Bible, to think about like, wait, how does this actually work out? Because what you believe may not be so. And many times I have come to the Bible thinking, oh, the Bible says this because what? I was taught it growing up. And then I look into it a little further. I was like, wait a minute. The Bible doesn't seem to be saying that at all. And so I want to inspire and encourage Christians to reopen their Bible, to just be inspired to dig deeper and find the golden nuggets that are in there if you'll look. Because if you've been a Christian for a long period of time, sometimes you just get bored of reading the Bible. You think you know all the stories, but I want to say that I don't think you understand them all. And so I think that you can have great conversations like the one that me and Brian are having and just get a little closer to God through our study of the scriptures.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think that this is the part that we're missing is when we come to say a debate like over at Donnie's channel. And yeah, it's obviously, we're debating each other, so we're going to have different positions. But the rare thing is when when the debaters can actually get together in a conversation like this. Now, look, I've debated people, before, and I've sent them follow-up emails saying, hey, let's get together and talk about some of these things. And most of the time they don't respond, but you're actually able to interact with someone on a peer-to-peer basis, which is not all that common in the debate world. So let me ask you this. Just as an overview of Genesis 3, I'm assuming that everybody who's watching this program knows that early Genesis is a hotly contended issue. It's a nest of issues. It's not just one, one dimensional, and that it really impacts the way that you view the rest of the Bible. So I think you understand this better than most people. So I guess I'm going to ask you plain flat out. As far as Genesis 3 goes, is this where you start your understanding of, say, doctrines like the messianic promises, the doctrines of salvation? Do you start those in early Genesis, or do you get those, say, more from like the books of the other books of Moses? Where do you start? You start there?
I do. I do actually. I'm actually going to take a harder stance than most people. And I actually think that Genesis was more clear to the original audience and has actually been misunderstood and lost over time. So it's one of these areas where I feel like lots of the Christian teachings, pastors, theologians, Bible scholars have been extremely unhelpful in this area regarding a lot of these issues. Now, I'm not saying all of them, but I feel like there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I do take this as a very strong, very deliberate messianic passage. And I don't take it as a second fulfillment, but as the primary meaning of the text. So I think that this was what the original authors, the original audience understood, and that it has been lost by other scholars today that they think that it is not messianic.
Yeah, and that's the first time I've you've revealed that to me. I think I'm pretty much the same way. I think that I think a lot of stuff got lost down the road. But let me ask you this: rather than go through all of the verses, I know that you said that you've been studying this for a long time. And so what do you see? What are some of the main elements you see in Genesis 3 that you think have vital doctrinal bearing on the rest of Scripture, and in particular, our faith?
Vital doctrinal bearing is maybe a little bit of a difficult term to weigh, but let me give you some highlights to where I feel like have been really, really misunderstood passages that do have an impact on our theology, or can. So by and large, most of our theology is derived and taken from the New Testament and from many other passages. And really what I'm here to show is that a lot of those doctrines were grounded in Genesis 3, and that the authors are actually drawing from Genesis 3. And so Genesis 3 truly is the place where a lot of fundamental, huge events take place. Now, shall we kick off the fireworks, Brian, or where do you want to go from here?
Well, yes, sure. Go ahead. I'll be behind
All
the
right.
bushes, though. I don't want to get burned.
Well, let's try this one on. So this is where this all started for me. Genesis 3:14. Genesis 3:14. Genesis 3:14 goes like this. So the context is that Adam and Eve have just eaten from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then afterwards, they go and hide, they get the fig leaves. And then finally, God comes down and he has a little sit down with the serpent, the woman, and the man. And so he says to the serpent, "Cursed are you above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you will go. All the days of your life you will eat dust." And of course, this has often been taken as a very literal passage in which it explains why snakes don't have feet, why they always crawl and slither on their bellies. But I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think that what's going on is that, number one, it is referring to Satan. And I don't mean it's referring to Satan as some sort of indirect secondary figure, but rather that the serpent is Satan. It is fundamentally Satan. And that is how it is supposed to be understood in the narrative. So it's referring to Satan, but then what does the passage mean if it's referring to Satan? Number one, it's referring to Satan, and it's meaning that he is changing positions. If we look at this in contrast with Genesis 3:1, right, it says the serpent was more cunning or wiser than any beast of the field. And so you should connect those dots, right? It's using the same literary structure. It should draw your attention back to the first verse of the chapter. But it says he was above all the beasts of the field. And now what it's saying is he's below all the beasts of the field. And so I think it's drawing this contrast between those two things. But the real crux that to me changed a lot for me was the very end of it when it says that he'll eat dust. Because at the end of the section, if you read all the way through 3:19, God says to Adam, "For you are dust, and to the dust of the ground you will return." You are dust, present tense. And so I just thought to myself, well, if God is referring to Adam as dust, then doesn't that mean that the serpent will eat man all the days of his life? And I think that's exactly what the first verse is referring to. It is talking about the serpent will seek to devour mankind all the days of his life. And this is where Satan begins his dominion over mankind.
Okay, that's a view that I think is very plausible, and I haven't heard that interpretation before. So you gave me something that I haven't heard, which is wonderful.
That's what I'm here
'Cause
for.
I don't get that. I don't get that a lot. But yeah,
You
so
can't find it in your books either.
no, it's really, I found it's really difficult. Sorry, I got the sniffles today. It's really difficult to find a really good book on, those passages. I think that there's been a lot of great material, but spread out over different books and different authors. So let me ask you this. So the promise about, the promise of the woman in labor and all that, she was promised that her seed would bruise the serpent's head. So what would you say to someone that would say like, well, it had to be Cain or Abel. It couldn't be something 2000 or in this case, 4,000 years off. It's got to be something that's, either one of her kids had to do it. So this is something this was fulfilled in Cain, or this was fulfilled in Seth, or whoever. What do you think about that? That's kind of a lame view, but you would get it from some of these modern, theologians. You would get something like that. What do you think of that?
I think the text almost explicitly tells us that it's not Cain. Now, I do think the text is also telling us that Eve thought and hoped it was Cain, but that Cain did not fulfill the requirements and therefore is not the Messiah. And this is actually encapsulated in the verse 1 of chapter 4, and then actually in verse 7. So in verse 4, right, the woman says, hey, behold, I have gotten a man. And now there's a little interesting thing. When you read it in Hebrew, it says this. Eve says, behold, I have gotten a man, Yahweh. There is no preposition there in the Hebrew. It is always translated as with the help of Yahweh, with the help of the Lord, from the Lord, by the Lord, something like that, because it sounds strange. What is she saying? If she's like, I've gotten a man, Yahweh. It sounds like she is saying she thinks maybe Cain is the man, Yahweh.
Yeah, that's very true. I think I've even made drawn that conclusion before. So the serpent will eat dust all the days of his life. So he's going to be against man all the days of his life. And so, as far as the curse of man, because he was told that he would, sweat and earn his bread by the sweat of his brow and all of that. And then I don't know what you think about the curse on the earth. I saw one of your debates. It was about animal death, though I don't think you guys brought up anything about the actual earth being cursed. But do you hold that to be still going on, or do you think that was absorbed by Christ, or do you think that was just being metaphorical? What do you think of that?
I think that it's covenantal language. And I think that this is one of the aspects that really confuses everybody, is that they feel like everything must be absolutely monolithic in every way. But I don't think that that's true. And part of the reasons that I don't think that's true is because of the future blessings that we see, right? So the curse on the ground, when it's talking to Adam, seems to have this connection to, Adam. And this is what Paul is contrasting all throughout Romans and Corinthians, right? In Adam, we all die, but in Christ, we all live. And I think that's part of the notion here, because what we see with Noah, right, is God says again with Noah, hey, be fruitful and multiply. But what's going on with Adam in 3:17 through 19 is that God is basically like, you won't be fruitful in Adam. That's what it's contrasting. So, for example, one of the other really big misconceptions are the thorns and thistles. The thorns and thistles are often taken as literal thorns and thistles, right? But it's not talking about a botany lesson. It's contrasting the fruitfulness that God gave them in Genesis chapter 1, right? When he said, be fruitful and multiply. Who is to be fruitful? Mankind. He's not referring to the plants there. And so when the ground will grow thorns and thistles, I think it's the idea that from Adam, life will not be produced. Life does not come from Adam. And this should even be thought further in the context of messianic prophecy, because then when you get to the other prophets and they say a sprout will spring up. A sprout, that sounds like the opposite of thorns and thistles, because what is it? It's living. A sprout is new life that is coming. It's not something dead. Thorns and thistles can be found all throughout the Old Testament, and they are often used as an illustration of something that is worthless and has no value. It's dead. And this is, of course, what it says even in the New Testament, right? The things that are worthless, thorns, thistles, they will be cut off and burned. They're of no value.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. So we've got a question coming in from, let's see, from Eastgate Adoptionist, and he says, well, he's asking you, did Eve's pride tell herself that her relationship with God wouldn't die if she redefined good and evil? Now, I don't know. I have a hard time understanding his question. Maybe you can make sense of that. I'm just going to let you answer it. If you need to rephrase it or something, we can always ask him to clarify, but what do you think?
So this is what I'm going to take a crack at it, because I was actually thinking about this sort of issue a little bit. And so I'm going to try and answer it as best as possible. But I often wondered about the whole notion about Eve being deceived, right? And it's like, why was Eve deceived, and why isn't that an excuse? Because the New Testament kind of condemns her for being deceived. And actually, throughout the Bible, God condemns people for being deceived. He condemns people. He's like, hey, you were deceived. And he's like, what? I will send lying prophets so that I will test my people, right? I'll send them false prophets. I'll test them. And it's a matter of like, okay, so those who aren't deceived are better. Like, how does that work? I think that part of it works this way. It has to do with she's deceived because she desired something God didn't. In other words, she didn't protect her desires, and she allowed her desires to influence her and deceive her in that way, because she was kind of led away by her desires into believing the serpent. And so I think that that's why she kind of ends up eating the fruit. As far as, some of these other I'm not 100% sure, but I think that, her relationship with God and redefining good and evil, I'm guessing you're just referring to the idea that when you eat from the tree, then you will redefine that which is good and evil, and that sort of notion. That could be what you're referring to there as one of the major ideas, but I hope that gets a little bit at the bulk of your question.
Yeah, and that's a fair answer. I liked that answer. You know, you and I think we have a lot in common as far as our interpretive approach. Let me put it that way. Even though we have different ideas on, the millennium and some other aspects of prophecy, I think these are good discussions. So I'm going to ask you the big question. Original sin, is it a thing or no?
You know what? I've actually been going over.
I was going to ask that. You knew I was going to ask that. Nobody can.
I've been
going
over
have
a.
Genesis 3 discussion about Genesis 3 and not broach the subject of original sin. I would be a reprobate if I didn't bring that up. So what do you think?
I will say in short how it's typically defined. I don't believe in that. My traditional understanding of original sin, I think I have mostly given up. Me and my other buddy Nathan have been talking about this a fair bit. And so my understanding of original sin in the beginning was this idea that in Adam, all of us sinned, and therefore we are all guilty under Adam. And so I don't think that that's what's going on. And I actually do think that some of this is borne out in the text. Now, what do I mean? Because I do think it is clear that something happens between us and Adam. But I don't think that that's the guilt in the same way that everyone else is putting it. So we all are punished for our own sins. But then it's like, well, then what's this connection with Adam? Because of course, Romans 5:12 is the big verse that everyone quotes, right? And it's talking about how death spread to all mankind because all mankind sinned. And it's like, okay, it doesn't say that sin spread to all mankind. I think that's important. But how it is connecting us is that Adam was given a covenant of eternal life. He's given a covenant of eternal life. If he would obey God's commands, he would maintain the garden and continue to eat from the tree of life for the rest of his life. And so therefore, he would live for forever in harmony and beauty and glory with the Lord and spread the garden. Great. But then he falls into sin, and that covenant then becomes a covenant of death. And all who sin are in that covenant. All who sin are in Adam. And I think that's what Paul is teaching in Romans. He's teaching that if you sin, you are in Adam. But if you put your faith in Christ, you are in Christ. Now, let me ask you a question, Brian, because it leads into exactly this. And it has to do with Genesis 3:15. And I feel like this is what's partially connected. In many of the accounts, it says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, right? Who are the seeds of the serpent and who are the seeds of the woman?
You're asking me that. To be honest with you, I did some videos on that before. I don't know. To put it very in generalistic terms, I would personally say, and again, this is my opinion. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scholar. I would say, well, the seed of the woman ultimately becomes Christ and his seed. And then the seed of the serpent ultimately becomes those who, I guess you would say, are outside of Christ. I guess that's the best way I would put it. What do you think?
Yeah.
Is that a good answer, or is that wrong?
It is.
Did I get it right,
mostly
teacher?
Right.
Okay.
You get a B plus. B plus.
Dang it! I was shooting for at least an A-, but that's okay. I can improve.
Yeah. To get the A-, we're going to improve you. We're going to improve you just a little bit. So there is the general seed of the woman, which are all the believers, and then yes, the promised seed. So I'm going to divide those two, and that's an important little distinction. It'll play further into our interpretive lens down the road here. So there is two. There is the general seed, which are us, you and me. We get to be seedlings, right? And then there is the promised seed. So now here's the major question then. If the seed of the serpent are simply, right, other bad people, right? They're followers of Satan. Who's the father of the children of the woman?
I don't know if I can answer. I would need time to think about that one. So let me ask you this: who's being divided up? Are you talking about the children of the woman? Are there's a dichotomy between the children of the woman, or there's a dichotomy between the seed of the serpent? Because I could see the seed of the serpent. People who haven't heard the gospel, they just die in Adam. I could see them, though, they're not the devil's children. There's a gray area. I understand gray areas. Is that what you're saying?
Sort of. But what I am saying is that the father of the children of the woman, their father is God.
Right. Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Now here's why I say that, because that's why I'm saying, like, the notion of us being under Adam is so important and so relevant, is because all who are under Adam, they're the fallen ones, right? This is why you have to be born again. You see, all the natural men who are born have to be born again. And this is exactly what I think Jesus is talking about in John chapter 3. John chapter 3, Jesus is referring to Genesis. This is one of the funny questions, is that Jesus challenges Nicodemus and he basically scolds him and says, wait, you're a teacher of the law and you don't know this? And my challenge to everybody else is to say, what is Jesus referring to? He's obviously saying there's something in the Old Testament, there's something in the Bible that you're missing. And when I've asked anybody today, nobody can tell me what he's referring to. They're like, yeah, he seems to be scolding Nicodemus, but I wish there was an Old Testament reference that he was pointing to. And I think that he is pointing to Genesis 3. That is what he's pointing to. It's the parental notion. Jesus is actually saying you have to be born again because what? He says, all who are born of flesh, and then you must be born of water and the spirit. Flesh and the spirit. Water is the natural birth. Spirit is the spiritual birth, birth of Christ, birth through the Holy Spirit. And then, yeah, that's what he's contrasting, Adam and God.
That's good interpretation. So let me throw something else out there. So you said spirit, water and the spirit. So I don't know what is your ecclesiological, I guess, what is your denominational platform? Do you believe in baptismal regeneration, or do you go with more of a believer's baptism? Because that's going to make a difference. You will admit that's going to make a difference because, born of water and the spirit, like say the Catholic Church that I was raised in, they'll take that as if, the water and the spirit, they work together. And you're literally born again when you're baptized. So I was born again in 1975. I didn't know it for 30 or for 29 years. You know what I'm saying? So what do you think about that? And
yeah,
let me
so
go get my tea real
towards...
quick, sir. And I'm just going to quickly grab my tea. So go ahead, talk.
Sure. Yeah, so I do believe in believers' baptism in general. And there could be a lot to be said about that. I really understand there are very good arguments on both sides. But I think part of the major thing that's going on here has to do with original sin. That's part of the reason why there were baptism for children, was because if you're born with original sin, then you need to be cleansed and purified of your original sin. But I do think that there is an important aspect of covenant and family relations. This is why also we have like circumcision in the Old Testament. I don't think that circumcision was ever meant to be an expression of your salvation or your goodness in and of itself. And how God decides to work out some things for babies, that's a whole nother conversation. But I do think it's very, very important that we do look at this from a covenantal standpoint. And which covenant are we in? And I do think that there are covenantal blessings that can take place because you're a part of a covenant family. The one good example that I think is very solid is the notion of Israel. Israel was God's covenant people. And while they followed God, they were tremendously blessed. And anybody who was in Israel at the time was blessed as well. They didn't even need to be believers in a sense. They just had to be in the proximity of the presence and the proximity of God's covenant people who were keeping it. So I think that there are tremendous blessings for children who are under a covenantal household, who are following God, who are obeying God's commands.
And that's a view that I think we should explore more as Christians, because, the Baptists are, they kind of want everybody in the fold, but there's, you got to, make the confession and all that. I understand all that. Anyways,
I think they're too American.
Yeah, I be honest with you, the only reason why I stay within, my circles is because I don't believe in bouncing around. I think that, I can fellowship with Baptists, I can fellowship with Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians. I don't agree 100% with anyone, with any group anyway. So chances are I'm just going to pull the elements out. I mean, that's the way I am. But besides, going back to Paul, I think any kind of sectarianism, I don't really think it's pleasing. I think it's something we need to move beyond. Maybe you have different thoughts on that. But anyways, um, got another question here from Eastgate Adoptionist. He says, let's see. Well, actually, he's following up. He says, we have to be repent and be baptized into his death. Children don't have an old man to get rid of. And I guess that's a good observation too. Children, but, see, I'm a Calvinist, so I believe in original sin. I believe, I believe in original sin. I believe that that it doesn't mean that, everybody's going to hell before what we would call the age of accountability, but we're born in sin. We sin, and that's children's sin. They do things they're not supposed to do. Anyways, I don't want to go down that rabbit trail. This is your time. Again, we could have a talk about these things in another discussion. But Eastgate Adoptionist is asking another question. He says, was Adam the first priest to take care of the garden relationship, but he then got kicked from the relationship, resulting in death? What do you think of that?
I lean towards the answer being yes. That's the really short answer. And then but then you also tag on a strange little part here. Then he said, but then got kicked from the relationship, resulting in death. I guess it depends on what you mean in this case, because to me, there are two deaths. There are two primary deaths, the first death and the second death. And that's really important. And I do think that both of them come from Genesis 2 and 3. But I think that the first one comes from the command that God gives in Genesis chapter 2, which says, do not eat from the tree. It's like, okay, cool. Then they eat from the tree, and resulting in sin. Sin brings in the second death. All who sin are doomed to judgment and death. But that death is the second death. But then later on, God also kicks them out of the garden. This results in the first death. The first death is the natural death, the death that we all will die, we'll all pay. And I think that those two things are different and should be understood separately.
Right. I would agree with the bulk of that. So I guess the big question would also be for me would be, I just want your opinion on this, is death. So you think that physical death was a result of the fall?
A result, in a sense, yeah, it's a result. I do think that it's a result. I think that it was a result, but also I would say, in a sense, it is God's mechanism and saving grace for mankind. So
okay.
he says when they sin, right, he's like, okay, now I don't want them to reach out and take from the tree of life. If they do, then they'll live forever. So therefore, he kicks them out of the garden. And so he is kicking them out of the garden to save them from an eternity of sin and death and just horribleness, I guess you could say, of sin. Yeah.
Right. And so how would you tie say Christ's death on the cross into this? Somehow link that up with Adam's punishment? Because the way I've always seen it was, and still is, Christ being the second Adam, that he had to stand in Adam's place. So Adam dies physically,
Mhm.
right? And so Jesus Christ, he has to physically die in order to be a substitute, so that he can, be a representative. So do you see a lot of that going on, or do you think that maybe that's something that's coming more from the New Testament, or how do you see that?
Yeah, so I do think that Christ pays the penalty for our second death. So he's facing the consequences, and he is representing, the punishment or death penalty that we would all face. Now, for a little bit of nuance, here's one of the more speculative areas that I think is a little bit fun, and I suspect is potentially correct, but I'm not going to stake as much on it as some of my other views. And that would be the notion, I've always wondered, did Satan know what was going to happen? What happened? right? With the whole cross thing, why did everything seem to go God's way and Satan seemed to be clueless? So here's my little bit of speculation. I don't think that he knew completely. He figured this was all going according to his plan. He was progressively killing the Messiah, and everything was going perfect, just as he planned, just as he wanted. But then Jesus is on the cross and he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he gives up his spirit to God. And I wonder if Satan at that moment felt like his victory was almost achieved and then snatched right out from underneath his feet and wondered, wait, what just happened? What just happened? And the reason I suspect this is, remember, the Romans are experts in execution. Everyone has always talked about how well the Romans understand execution to the very moments. And the soldier goes back and reports to Pilate, hey, he's dead. And Pilate's like, really? Are you sure? Go make sure, right? And then they send out the soldier and stab him through the side because they're in disbelief. They're like, he shouldn't be dead yet. Why is he dead? And so I wonder if Christ actually becomes a sacrificial lamb by voluntarily giving up his life, which was unexpected and not anticipated. And it wasn't merely Christ being physically killed by the Romans or Satan or anything like that, but that he sacrificially gave himself, effectively stealing away the plans from the enemy.
That's a good, some good thoughts to ponder. I wanted to say though, when you were talking, I had an aha moment. Has anybody ever told you that you talk and look similar to Quentin Tarantino?
No, that's a new one.
If you,
Never got that one.
you need to watch something by Quentin Tarantino. Your voice sounds exactly like him. And you even
Oh
if
my
you
goodness.
if you shaved your mustache and your beard, you'd probably look a lot like him too. Anyways, I wanted to say that, but I think you have a lot of food for thought. I'm going to say that we have some different views on like, death and whatnot, but that's fine. And this is something where I think, and I want to ask your opinion on this too, where you think like different views on Genesis 3 can be harmonized, because it seems like there's so much disagreement among the different groups. We see debates happening on Genesis 3. You participated in a couple. I haven't really done any debating on that, but I've seen some debates going on. And we have issues with, death, spiritual death, physical death. So theologians, as you know, will generally say, well, there's spiritual death. Mankind is under spiritual death. And of course, there's going to be physical death. And that we're resurrected from those either now or after, or maybe in two stages. But do you think there's like a make or break? This is like a make or break. Like if you get early Genesis wrong, that you're going to have like not be able to understand the Bible? Or do you think there's a way that you could just, hop into the New Testament and kind of get it that way? Are you going to be missing something? How do you see that? How do you see that correlation? Is it a vital correlation, or is it something that we can kind of negotiate on?
Vital is a difficult term. And the reason I say that vital is a difficult term is because, like many others, we all talk about it's like, hey, look, if you believe in the cross of Jesus Christ, that he lived, died, rose again on the third day, those things are essentially vital. What I do think is that I do think you'll miss a lot. I think not completely understanding Genesis, you do kind of miss stronger theological ties. One example to me is that I think that Paul and John, they are hitting on Genesis chapter 3 and 4 like a decent bit. Like Paul doesn't hit on Genesis 4 as much, but I think that John does. And I think that it's really, really unfortunate that so many scholars don't see this. And I basically just want to ask them, what do you think? These apostles just made this stuff up? Like, to me, I know so many people that they talk as though the apostles are making entirely new theology, entirely new ideas that are completely different from the Old Testament. And I just don't see that at all. I feel like the Bible is continuing to tell basically one story, and that the apostles, including Paul, are merely expounding on what was already there in Genesis. He's not telling us something entirely new. When he says, for the wages of sin is death, yeah, where do you think he got that from? I think he still gets this ideas from the early chapters of Genesis. So I think that there are a lot of things that people are missing these connections. And I feel like what it does is it really strengthens our Bible, the biblical integrity, our theology, by understanding Genesis 3 really well.
Yeah, I think you made some good points. So, I agree with you that the apostles were not making new stuff up. Of course, if you ask a lot of like the critical guys, they'll say, well, the apostles were kind of wing dinging it. They had their own agenda and all this, and you get into all these, these arguments as Peter was writing against Paul and Paul was writing against James, and it kind of it's, well, how can you know this stuff? It's like you know this for a fact, you were there. But when we get to early Genesis, I think that's important because, as you said, this is something that I think they were building off of, like Christ was building off of early Genesis. We know because he quoted early Genesis. So when he said,
Yeah.
What God hath put together, let not man sunder. They shall be one flesh. Let me ask you this: with this idea of one flesh, do you see that as being like a reunion between, say, the bride of the church, I guess you would say, and Christ? Do you think there's some typology going on there?
Well, yeah, I think that Paul pretty much just says that in Ephesians chapter 5. Right? When he says that it's literally what he's referring to. He's like, oh, and I'm speaking of Christ and the church, although this is a great mystery. Now, the other thing that I think is really interesting about that is I think it is quite likely that is the first prophetic verse in the Bible concerning a much more straightforward prophecy. And it's that notion that there will be these two, and that there will be a man who comes, right? And he will be joined to his bride.
Right. Yeah. And again, I agree. I think there's a lot of stuff also. And I know you probably don't have a high opinion of the church fathers, but in some of the early fathers, I think there's some stuff about that as well. I mean, Irenaeus was very typological. I don't want to call him a master of typology, because I would say that, I'm the master of, no, I'm just joking. But actually, well, we're all masters in our own right. Right. So,
we're in our own eyes.
In our own eyes. Yeah. Well, actually, I try to have the humility to know that, I learned from a lot of people. I'm learning a lot from you. I've watched a lot of your programs, and, I'm getting some stuff from you as well. And I find that what I'm doing is it's expanding my horizon so that I'm able to incorporate more material in. As far as, and we're going to jump ahead just a little outside of Genesis 3, because I want to ask you about Genesis 4. Now, you'd mentioned the two seeds, and I don't know if anybody agrees with me on this. I know some book theologians that would, but as far as living, like breathing theologians, would you say that, like, say, Cain and Abel, would you say that Cain represents, in him is concentrated the seed of the serpent, and then of course in Abel is concentrated the seed of the woman? Do you see it like that? Do you see anything happening there which maybe points to what was going on in the first century with the seed of the serpent, Christ, and then ultimately killing him? Because I think that if we can make a connection between those two, I think that right there gives a lot of force and support to inspiration. But what are your opinions?
Yeah, I'm going to lay it out even more thorough than that to some extent. I think that the Bible is extremely clear that Cain is the seed of the serpent. Now, remember what I said about Genesis 3:14, right? Genesis 3:14 has to do with the serpent who eats man, right? So you should ask yourself this question: who are the seeds of the serpent? I know I asked you already. And the answer is, you should read the verses in context. And it's this: all whom the serpent devours become his children. That's how you should read Genesis 3:14 and 15. And that's exactly what you see. Genesis 4:7. Now, I never got to explain earlier exactly why. Why do we know that Cain is not the Messiah and that this prophecy is not fulfilled and gone and done away with? We know this because of Genesis 4:7. In Genesis 4:7, Cain is pissed at his brother. He does not like his brother at all. And God comes to him and says, "Hey, why is your countenance fallen? Don't you know if you do what is right, you will be lifted up? Sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." And so what he is saying to him is that, hey, look, watch out. You need to overcome this. Who is the one crouching at the door? It is the serpent. It is the idea that the serpent is crouching at the door and he is seeking to devour Cain. And so when Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, he says, Satan is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, I think that he's quoting from Genesis. That's exactly what he's thinking of. He's thinking of this idea of Satan crouching, seeking to devour somebody. And so then what happens? Cain is devoured. He gives into temptation. He is devoured by his hatred and jealousy and kills his brother. And this is what it says in John. So in 1 John chapter 3 and then John 8:44, right? Jesus says, you're not children of your father. You're not children of Abraham. You're children of your father, the devil, right? And why does he say this? He says this because of their jealousy of Christ for his righteousness and their hatred and desire to murder him, right? And he says, for Satan has been a liar and a murderer from the beginning. He is calling back to Genesis. Satan was always the one who was jealous and wanted to murder. He wants to kill. And so that's exactly what you have. And then in 1 John 3, John actually says, for Cain was a seed of the evil one, or a son of the evil one, son of Satan. And so you should absolutely think that, yeah, Cain is the seed of the serpent. Okay. So this is the part, right? Why do we know then that Cain isn't the Messiah? Because Genesis 3:15 promises that the Messiah, he will crush the head of the serpent. He will not give in to temptation. And that's what you're supposed to be thinking when you read Genesis 4:7, is that, wait a minute, this is what's supposed to happen. And so when Cain falls, we know, not the Messiah. We need to wait for somebody else. Now, I know you didn't ask this, Brian, but I'm going to interject a little bit, not to spoil your show. The centerpiece of Genesis 3:14 through 19 is Genesis 3:16. That's what this is all about. That's what this is all about. Because you know what? That's what Genesis 4:7 is re-quoting. In Hebrew, it is almost identical. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. You following along with me so far?
Oh yeah.
A little bit?
Are you having any trouble over there? Like, Cam, I'm having a little bit of a difficulty over here. I don't know why it does this. Every time throughout the day, problems with the day, but whenever I try to do one of these, it seems to act. I don't know whether that's a divine message or whether that's the devil telling me he wants me to leave.
Dear Jesus, bring clarity to the image and the audio.
I would hope so. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you've made a very good point, and that's something that I think should be looked at. So you're talking about the verse in 3:16, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So you're saying there's a connection between that and Genesis chapter 4, where he's talking about sin, or the sin offering, as some would say, crouching at the door. Is that what you're saying? Now that's just a translation, because some you probably know this already, but some would say that's what he's talking about. Well, don't be mad. If you do evil, there's a sin offering crouching at the door, and you can bring that offering instead of the offering of your own works. Is that how you see that? Or I don't quite know. I guess I didn't
Let me
catch what
explain a
you were
little bit.
saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. Let me translate Genesis 3:16. All right. So I'm going to retranslate it for you. All right. This is what it says. And he said to the woman, I will multiply your sorrow and conceiving. In futility, you will birth sons. Your desire will be for your man child, and he will rule over you.
Okay, let me see that.
I know it's not going to be there in your text, but that's what the
No.
verse
I got the
actually
Hebrew.
said.
I've got Hebrew.
Oh, great.
I've got Hebrew. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
need to access it. It's all on my phone.
There you go.
Let's
Oh,
see.
there you go. Hebrew at the touch of a phone. That's awesome.
Well, yeah, you need these helps, because let's see. Did you say 3:7, or did you say 4? It was 4:7, right?
4:7. It's 3:16 and 4:7.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
You see, the word for husband is ish, right?
Right.
Word for husband is ish. And so her desire will be for her ish, and he will rule over her. That's the word that's used in 4:1. I have gotten an ish with the help of the Lord, or Yahweh.
You shall rule over it. This is something that I would have to look at in detail. I see what you're saying.
Yes.
Obviously, this is, Hebrew, Greek, let me ask you this. I'll throw you this question. Is this
Sure.
is this something that you came up with on your own, or is there like another theologian that came up with? Because if I could get some scholarly support for a view, I usually end up paying more attention to it.
Sure. So this is something that I did discover on my own, but I have found a couple others that do hold this. One, Professor David Kingler at Dallas Theological Seminary, who holds 2 doctoral degrees. He holds this view. And it is the view that in Genesis 3:16, the man who is being spoken of is the Messiah. It's not referring to Adam at all. What it is 3:16 is a prophetic verse, and the whole verse is talking much more about the same notions as 3:15. You should read 3:15 and 3:16 in conjunction with one another.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And this is what I'm saying. This is why I like these discussions, because they're always bringing out something out that you've never thought of before. So I like the idea of, and I'm going to be honest with you, I like the idea of Genesis 4, with the 2 seeds. And this is why I asked you last time, when people get a chance to watch the one that we did last week, because I asked a question that I was like, I was serious about this. And I keep asking this question. Nobody can really answer me, but I think you might have answered me, but this is a question I guess I'll have to ask again. Is talking about Cain, he was banished from the land. So he killed his brother, and then he was banished from the land. Now, to me, I see that's got to be 80-70, banishment from the land. But after he was banished from the land, he didn't just, history didn't just swallow him up, right? He actually ended up building a city, and he ended up inventing like music, and there was inventions going on, and then there was like
let's
very
take this a
harsh
step
legal
further.
code. Okay.
Let's connect. You know what? He's banished from the city, right? But then what? Well, actually, I guess I don't know your view on this, but Jerusalem becomes the harlot. Babylon, right? And Babylon is known for its licentiousness, its all of these sorts of notions. So if you want to, and maybe you don't take that view, but I'm just saying, like, running with the typology, you have this exact notion of the woman who is the virgin bride, and then the other woman who is the harlot. And the harlot is represented, even if you just want to go back to Old Testament typology of what Israel is playing the harlot. They are the ones who are going out there and doing what? Living it up, partying, music, dancing. It's the same notion of the prodigal son, right? When the prodigal son leaves, what's he do? He goes out and lives the city life, enjoys all of the pleasures, all the things that you can imagine.
Yeah, and that I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know you had said that you believed that later on there was an eruption, I guess, of angelic activity. Angels were mating with humans. Um, that was something that I've always kind of, I guess I held that view at one point because, I was reading a lot of church fathers. And of course, I was reading I was just investigating a lot of dispensation literature. Most of the new ones believe that, but some of the old ones didn't. They believe that there was the daughters of men. You've heard this view. The daughters of men were the seed, the godly seed, and the godly seed ended up mating with and marrying into the wicked seed, and that corrupted. I guess that corrupted the morals of mankind to the point where God brought a judgment. But they do have something in there about angels, and I don't understand it all. I'm not really even sure if that's like mythology meant to cover up something that's really like we can understand, like that. Where the seed of the woman, the godly seed ends up getting corrupted by the wicked seed, and it ends up degrading their morals to the point where the whole world is filled with wickedness. And that's the reason why God brought the flood. So I'm wondering, well, if you look at what's going on this is why I asked you last time, look what's going on with like music, like the music industry and the entertainment industry. And it's like, man, where did this come from? Like I said last time, when they were in the 50s, people were saying that Elvis was like the seventh son of a seventh son. He was Satan incarnate because he was doing his licentious little hip dance. And now look where we are right now. How did that come about? I mean, it's only been since World War II, really, that's happened. But what happened at the end of World War II? And I'm not trying to be controversial or anything, but there's something that happened at the end of World War II, like a couple of years after that, when a city had been destroyed by God, and then it went and ended up being rebuilt again. And where do you get that? You get that from the story of Ahab and Jezebel. Well, it starts with Jericho being thrown down after they entered the land, but then centuries later. So I'm saying, I'm throw that out there. That's not dogmatic. It's something I throw out there just to make people think. But I'm wondering, with all of this going on, do you see any elements of this playing into, say, end time theology? I know you're an Amil. Anything connected with Genesis 3 or even 4 or even any of those other early chapters?
Well, I mean, in some sense, yes, because all of history seems to be cyclical, right? I mean, the sins that are committed back in the days are the same ones we commit today, so I certainly feel like there's just so many cycles of exactly that, and people like abandoning God, being jealous of the other ones, like, yeah. So, I mean, in that sense, I certainly do. As far as specifics or details, I'm not too sure, I guess.
Yeah. And that's probably something that we could we could talk about these things, just have dialects about them. Because the last thing I want to do is like set up shop and be like, okay, guys, I'm going to be the next, hot shot in biblical prophecy. And I've got a ministry and I'm writing books and everything. And no, I don't do that. I got another question here for you though. Let's see.
Yeah.
Eastgate Adoptionist. And this guy, he has some of the great questions that we receive on this channel. Was Jesus tempted in the same way as Adam in the wilderness after his baptism? Was Jesus tempted to start a church like early Catholics? And now we got Phelan, I know you were raised a Catholic, and now I'm going to get you back for that, for saying something good about the Roman Catholic Church. What's your opinion?
I mean, I guess I don't know if he means something in particular by the same way as Adam. I mean, I don't know. I guess it depends on how you take some of those things. So, for example, Jared Moore, he makes some sorts of distinctions between temptations. I don't really accept his definition, but I mean, so to me, I guess I lean more towards the idea when the New Testament says that he was in all ways tempted like us or tempted like we were, that yeah, in some sense he was tempted like Adam. But yeah, so I guess that part, yeah, Jesus tempted to start a new church like the early Catholics. I'm not actually sure exactly what you mean by that. I mean, Jesus did start a church, the church that we're all a part of. But yeah, I don't know if you mean something particular. Uh, I guess maybe what you could mean is the Catholic Church. I don't think he meant to start that because I'm not Catholic, so I don't accept Catholicism and their doctrines. So I don't think that's what he had in mind.
I was hoping to score a win. Actually, I was just hoping for the first 30 years of my life to have some validity in the eyes of I guess ecclesiastical Christendom. But I'm going to ask you a really good question. This question, you're going to love this question because I think the hardest question I've ever been asked, and this is going 20 years back, hardest question I've ever been asked about these early chapters of Genesis. And it's something that we had talked about or we had touched upon. It's in Genesis chapter 4, and it talks about when Cain was banished, he went and he built a city. I believe he dwelt in the land of Nod. And then it shows him having a bunch of kids. Now, okay, I got this question, and then there's going to be another question a little bit later on. How did he have kids if there were no other human beings? That's a tough question.
This is a really good question, and it's a very interesting question. And so this is one of the ones that I'm really interested in the answer, and I'm going to give an answer that I'm still mulling over. But I think it has a lot going for it. And I was really surprised of its impact after kind of hearing this notion. And so it would be this. We have to go back to Genesis chapter 1. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. And it says that God made man in his own image. And so it's like, okay, cool. Male and female, he created them. Okay, cool. All right. Then you go to Genesis chapter 2. Well, and then he does all this stuff with Adam. Now, here's the major question. Why shouldn't we read it chronologically? This is the funny thing to me about the young earth creationists is they're like, read Genesis 1 chronologically, 6 days, all this stuff. Every day is boom, 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 boom. And then they totally changed tune in Genesis chapter 2. But one of the arguments that's really been proposed here is that there is a Toledot there in Genesis chapter 2. And these are the generations of the heaven in the day that God created the heavens and the earth. So a Toledot is the generations of, right? And so we see that throughout Genesis through 1 through 11. And these are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Abraham. Okay. Never does a Toledot go back and recount things that took place before it. They only tell what happens afterwards. And so therefore, if that's true, then you have human beings being made in the image of God prior to the garden. And it's like, okay, but then, what do you do with Adam and Eve? How does this make sense? It makes sense because they would say Genesis 2 takes place directly after Genesis 1. And you're going to like this a little bit, Phelan, because, well, why would that make any sense? Because it's the 8th day. Adam is made on the 8th day. The priests are consecrated on the 8th day. Circumcision takes place on the 8th day. Jesus raises from the dead on the 8th day. That is the day when everyone is sanctified. They are consecrated unto the Lord. And so Adam is made as the priest of the garden on the 8th day. And they would say that this is a special creation of Adam because he is the unique priest meant to take care of the garden. So, therefore, you have mankind and a special creation of Adam and Eve in the garden. And so you have other human beings. You have other human beings. And this is where Cain gets his wife from. And the further reason to suspect that this may be true is that Israel had very harsh laws and thoughts and morals about incest. Incest was not acceptable. And the idea that somebody would be like, oh, but they had incest in the beginning would still have been like a prohibition and taboo to many of the people at the time. So that would be one way you could answer that question.
Right. And that's interesting as well. My other question, which would be, again, it's another challenge, is I guess goes back to when Adam and Eve were created, and it said replenish the earth, as if, the earth had been, filled before with perhaps, human beings. Now, look, I know you're an old earth creationist, and I'm, one of those guys that's kind of in the middle. I think the earth is way older than 6,000 years. But I'm not ready to go with science and all of the geological ages and all that. I don't and I grew up reading H.G. Wells's Outline of History, so I know about all that. But is there any I guess validity in the notion that some of these skeletons and remains and that we find, that I guess the scientists would say that they were predecessors of Homo sapiens? Are they actually linked to us, or was this part of an older creation that was perhaps destroyed? Some people may point to Genesis 1:2, where the earth became Hayah, without form. Of course, that could mean was as well. It's used in the sense of was several times in the Old Testament, also uses became, but we don't really know. There's not there. I heard somebody actually ask you that question on one of your debates. I think it might have been the partial preterist.
It was
guy,
the preterist. Yeah,
and there's not really, like I said, that it could go either way, because I don't think there's not enough in the context to indicate whether it's used in the sense of was or become. But what's your opinion about a primal creation being created by God prior to, say, the 6 or 7 days of Genesis of creation? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah. So number one, so really my position as far as the age of the earth goes is that I'm agnostic. I'm agnostic concerning the age of the earth. I'm fine with, take a middle position or one of those things. I feel like those are scientific questions. I feel like the Bible is pretty clearly agnostic on the age. It just doesn't tell us, just doesn't say. And so as far as some of this goes, I think that it's also just the case. It just doesn't really tell us much. I do think, and I've heard of several scholars, they give their explanations as to why became is not the correct interpretation or translation because of some Hebrew grammatical rules, that there's like a vav disjunctive here in the early first 2 verses. So therefore it kind of rules out this possibility of becoming. But rather that, so I do lean towards the idea that becoming is not really a correct interpretation there. But regardless of it saying becoming, I don't even think that it needs to say becoming, because I think that what it says just leaves everything open. It just leaves it open, because all that we do know is that the earth is void and formless, and there's darkness over the surface of the deep. That's all we know. That's all it says. And so if the world is just in a chaotic state, it says absolutely nothing as to what happened prior. Now, I understand that some people want to input or try and show like, oh, but this is judgment language, and so God must have done something in the past. He might have. There's lots of things that could have happened. I just don't think that the text is explicit in telling us this was judgment language. God did do this. But I think that it is okay to be a little bit more open-handed than some of the others who basically just want to say, no, we are it. We're all that's ever been, fill in the blank. And my biggest reason, lastly, for thinking that is simply the Bible doesn't say when he created the angels either. So that means there's other things that he did without us.
Right. Yeah, and that's all fair. I mean, that's all good. I can understand. I think sometimes it's better to take those approaches and say, "Look, we really don't know. Could be it's possible that this could be this interpretation or that." And that's one of the things I guess made me want to have you on the show is because not a lot of people can do that. I like to qualify my language enough so that if I don't know something, I'm just going to tell you, look, I don't know. Now, when I was a young guy, had just entered the ministry, I read my Bible through 6 or 7 times. I knew everything. If you had asked me anything in the world, I would have given you an answer. But I know you've been in the book for a while. And I know that as you probably experienced this yourself, as you get older and as you learn more, you realize that it's not always as cut and dried. And I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to kind of segue into this question because I think that we have a lot of different interpretations being put forward as to surrounding early Genesis and what this means, what that means. And what we want to maintain, I think you'll agree with this, is that we want to maintain a certain level in the midst of all this conflicting opinion. We want to maintain a certain level of positivism so that we don't, go off the deep end and be like, well, we can't really know anything. We don't want to become agnostic, right? We want to maintain enough dogmatic positivism to stay within the confines of not just the faith, but a faith, to know that we stand on something. What do you think is the recipe for handling these problems? Because we've talked about several of them. I asked you about Genesis 4, and I asked you about, Genesis 1, verse 2. And there's got to be a way to approach a robust variety of interpretations while at the same time understanding that we don't want to be creating agnostics as we discuss these things. So this is one of the questions I guess that I would ask you as just a regular, everyday man of God who perhaps teaches others. How do we handle this situation? There's so much dialogue, there's so much debate, and we want to make sure that we're maintaining a degree of positivism. How do we do it?
That's definitely a very difficult question. And it's very difficult, especially amidst all of these controversial texts, which are by far very, very controversial, and that there are good Christians on both sides. There are young earth creationists, old earth creationists, and theistic evolutionists. So it's very, very challenging in that regard. So I hope you'll accept my answer as a little bit more of pastoral advice, because I think this is probably the wiser aspect and the wiser way to go. One is that you have to work out for yourself some of these issues, because you know what? Nobody else is going to do your push-ups for you. And in the end, if you're out there defending the faith, guess what? You're the one who has to give the answer. So you have to decide for yourself. And that was one of the reasons I decided to study these things. Was I'd really left some of these questions much more open. I was just like, I don't know. I just don't know the answer. And so I wanted to study for myself to have a solid answer. Two, I really think that you have to be okay with some ambiguity. You have to be okay with some ambiguity. Now, to get further down to what is it are you going to proclaim? What is it you're going to proclaim? You got to study your Bible. And this is my last charge. And the reason that I think it's okay to be a little bit looser about some of these things is that you're going to grow. Hold positions, have positions, decide like, okay, this is what it is. I'm a young earth creationist. I think that's clearly what the Bible teaches. You know what? I was a young earth creationist. I fought and defended those views, but I don't anymore. And now I'm actively debating against some of those options. And so I think, we can be positive in that, just affirm the faith, preach what you believe to be true, and be willing to grow up. Because it is irresponsible to think that you at 20 are not going to change any of your views when you're 40, when you're 50, when you're 60, and have 20, 30, 40 years of experience and 20, 30, 40 years reading the Bible. It's not even reasonable for you to come to that conclusion. In fact, I would suggest that if you have exactly the same views from when you were 20 until you're 60, you did not grow. You did not grow. So there's no way that you can be 100% certain that all of your views are correct. But what I would say is the views that you believe in them as you're believing in Christ, and be dogmatic, be strong about them, and just be willing to grow up when God shows you something new.
Right. And that's sound advice. I think a lot of people would agree with that. I just, with all these debates, and I watch some of these debates, and I just, a lot of times I'll just shake my head, because it's like, I mean, people are just pulling out all kinds of stuff. And it's like, I think there needs to be, this is kind of off topic, but I kind of think there needs to be like some hedges. I think there needs to be like some stone walls or something to keep people from going, because look, we've had, and I've been talking about this for years, 2,000 years of Christian teaching. We've had, saints, we've had scholars, we've had people. I don't believe in evolution. So I think that people understand. I think anybody can understand. If you were on a deserted island with a Bible, and I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. And you had a Bible, you didn't know anything about Christ. That was the only book. And you said, well, I got to kill some time. I've already killed all my crabs and, done shelled them and all that, picked some papayas and done that. I need to do some reading. I think you have enough in that book to understand the doctrines of where you stand as a sinner, and what you need to do to be saved, and all of that. I understand that's anybody can do that, but when it comes time for like dogmatic formulas and authoritative, and as Sam Frost would agree with me on this, authoritative teaching, you got to know, you got to be like educated. You have to have studied theology. You should probably know something of the original languages. You need to have studied the patristics. You need to have know a little bit about church history. And what I'm seeing on YouTube is I'm seeing like just a lot of people, like they come out of nowhere. You don't even know who they are. And it's like now all of a sudden they've got a YouTube channel and they're like acting like all of these experts. And it's like, where the hell did you come from? And it's not informed theology. It's just, one guy pulling out his own private interpretation. And this is the reason why people have accepted full preterism, is because it sounds good. You have a slick salesman who's selling it, who's peddling it, making everything sound good. Yeah, this generation soon, etc. But don't you think there needs to be like more authority? Because the Catholics and some of the high Protestants as well, and a lot of the academics, and like I said, Sam Frost would agree, there has to be some degree of authority that has to be brought back into the ranks of Christendom to prevent like this rampant theorizing of just any interpretation under the sun that will possibly float if you can tie if you could have one of those fishing
you can make
bobs,
it float, just let it go.
If you can bob to it and make it flow, there you go. That's the truth. Don't you think there has to be something more than just the scriptures, or are you going to stand by sola scriptura?
Well, it's difficult. Depends on exactly what you mean. Because like I said, I'm not Catholic, but what I do believe in the local church. I do believe your pastor should be an authority in your life. And I do think that there are some Christians who have basically gone Ronin, right? They're just completely on their own, no authority whatsoever. And I believe in authority. I believe in having somebody over you, having somebody who can speak into your life and help you talk about and discuss these issues. And yeah, unfortunately, I think that full preterism is a horrible, egregious, slam against Christianity, the very doctrines of Christianity. And so, I think you should very much be into your Bible and have some brothers and sisters in Christ and somebody who can speak into your life, somebody who's more than just a brother and sister, but somebody who is a pastor.
Right. So here we got a question from SoCal Preston. And matter of fact, he and I are good friends. He's been on here several times. And as a matter of fact, he's one of the main debaters over at Donnie Badensky's channel. He's like one of the most feared persons. Nobody will debate him on certain subjects because they know they'll get creamed.
What's he debate?
He's asked. He debates the Apocrypha, and he debates dispensationalism, particularly Israel and Israel's role in Israel's salvation, as opposed to say a lot of the issues regarding James and James versus Paul. But he's asking, Josephus says the sons of God in Genesis 6 are angels. The book of Jubilees says Cain married his sister. Two credible sources. What do you think of that?
I agree with the first, and the second one, well, as far as Jubilees, I mean, unfortunately, I'm not Catholic, so I don't necessarily accept Jubilees as credible. So I'm not sure too much to say about that one. Maybe Cain married his sister. Maybe he didn't. I don't really, to say that Jubilee says it doesn't really settle it for me. But I agree with the first one. Sons of God in Genesis 6 are reference to angels. So no problems there.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Like I said, I could go either way. I'm not necessarily against that view. I just think Dave would appreciate this with if you read like Schofield or I think Bullinger did hold the angelic view, but there's a couple of them that said that those were the sons of God were the good seed, or the sons was it the daughters of, I forget how it goes.
I got you. Yeah. The sons of,
right.
Yeah.
The godly intermarried with the wicked, and they corrupted mankind. That's why he brought the flood. Now there is this narrative about angelic interference, but I think that's a topic for another, maybe even a panel discussion if Dave wanted to do something of that nature. What were you going to say?
I'll just say that what convinces me at the moment that they were angels involved in Genesis 6 is the New Testament. If it was only for the Old Testament and we did not have any New Testament texts, I would be much more prone to accepting some sort of Sethite view or the tyrant king view, one of these other views. But I feel very compelled because of the New Testament to accept the idea that they were angels. So, and that can totally be a whole other conversation sometime.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I think we brought up some good points. Like I said, I didn't want to give my beliefs or anything because everybody has access to those. I wanted to see what you thought on these. So let me ask you this. Yeah. Are there any debates in the offing, anything else? I mean, you've been doing a ton of debates over at Donnie's channel. Anything you got? What's your next one?
Turt and Fan. I'm debating Turt and Fan on conditional immortality versus ECT. So we will technically be debating, will the torment of the wicked end? Will the torment of the wicked end? So I will be supporting the annihilationism view, and he will be arguing the traditional view.
That's going to be a good one. I'm looking forward to that. I've watched some of his stuff. I mean, he's a Calvinist, but he's like one of those, straight, really narrow, straight-laced Calvinists. And those are the guys that like I talked to you last week, those are the guys who think everything was ordained in eternity. So see, this is the thing. I don't know how they're going to get around. Well, what's the point of praying if you can't change the outcome? What's the point? But that's something that obviously. Okay, hold on. Okay, so he just lost power. He's going to try to get back on. Let's see if we have any more questions. Let's see. Oh, and Dave says Schofield's held to the Seth view. So yeah, I don't have his Bible in front of me, but yeah, it was pretty much, that was the view that I was talking about. Let's see. So he's going to try to get back on while we're waiting for him. Let me just go ahead and say, we've got another question coming through. Wait, please ask this question from your debate. Did the bride in Revelation 19 need to clean herself up for the marriage to the Lamb because she was the mainstream Babylonian church that had just ended? So that's a good question. but that had to do with our debate that we did a few weeks back. And I actually don't know if he wants to answer that or not. Let me just go ahead and see if he's going to be able to get back on. And then if he's not, then what I will do is I will go ahead and answer that, because I don't think that the Babylonian, there was a Babylonian church in the book of Revelation, to be perfectly frank. I'm just not seeing that. Let's see. Okay, so I just sent him a message. Yeah, I don't take the view that the church is Babylon. I don't take that view. Now, it's possible that, as far as the future fulfillment goes, that the church that there may be the false bride could be Babylon, but I don't think that was here he is. I don't think that was the original meaning. I don't think that was the primary meaning of the text. I think it had to do with Jerusalem. And then there may be a more distant meaning at the end of the Adamic age. And that may have something to do with the bride, or may have something to do with a return of the false bride in the last 7 years. That's my opinion. What do you think? Glad to see you back, Adam. This was from our debate. He actually asked Donnie a question and we got cut off. So he's asking this, and I just answered it. Wait, please ask this question from your debate. Did the bride in Revelation 19 need to clean herself up for the marriage to the Lamb because she was the mainstream Babylonian church that had just ended? What were your thoughts on that?
I'll definitely I'll give it a Brian Simmons answer. I'm not 100% sure as much, but I'll say that I just lean much more towards the idea that it's not really the bride cleaning herself up. As far as the imagery in Revelation goes, it's just talking about two separate ones. So the bride isn't really cleaning herself up. She is the pure and holy one, and it's the wicked one that I don't think, is going to be. The bride is already clean because she's washed in the blood of the Lamb.
Yeah. And one of these days, what we'll have to do is, I understand that we're having some connection issues. So I think we're at a good stopping point. We're almost 90 minutes in. I think what we need to do is we need to possibly regroup and have another discussion, because we've touched on so many great points, but we could only basically just, touch the tip of the iceberg with some of these answers. But I want to thank you, Adam. I think this has been a great discussion. Yeah, and so he answered back, and he said the wife hath made herself ready. Like I said, I personally don't agree with the view that that this is all about Rome. I don't think, because I take it as AD 68, was written in, and you and I, we went back and forth. I think it was written in AD 68. I think the last thing that John had on his mind was the Roman Catholic Church. I don't see that at all. And as far as Rome, Rome is involved, but I think he was talking about Nero as the beast. Anyways, that's a different discussion. And maybe that's a discussion that we can have next time.
Yeah.
When was Revelation written? Even if, I know I mentioned this to Donnie a few months back, and I said, hey, look, if anyone is interested in debating the dating of Revelation, I would love to take the early date. Because as a futurist, now I understand preterism and all that, all those arguments. I was formerly a full preterist. But if anybody wanted to debate that, they could get in touch with Donnie and say, hey, we found somebody. But that's, even if you wanted to, we could have a discussion about it too on the channel. But do you have any last words, anything you'd like to say, any announcements or anything like that?
Do I have what?
Do you have any last words or anything you'd like to say, any announcements?
So if you want to tune into my upcoming debate, so I'll be debating Turd and Fan coming up on annihilationism. I think that's December 12th, 13th. I'd have to go back and look on Donnie's channel. And then I'm also debating Ben Kissingling on young earth creationism in January, and then CJ in February. And then, yeah, you know what? My other thing is, hey, if there's anyone that wants to debate, I am taking a few different topics: young Earth creationism, annihilationism versus pretty much the opposing views. And then, yeah, if you want to debate eschatology, yeah, feel free to come and debate me on eschatology as well.
Okay. Sounds great, Adam. I want to thank you for coming on the show. And I also want to thank everybody for watching. I hope everyone has a blessed evening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Brian.